They tased his wife in broad daylight, arms full of groceries, her knees buckling on the driveway as apples scattered and a milk carton burst open like a white grenade across the concrete. Joseph Callahan didn't scream, didn't struggle against the zip ties slicing into his wrists. He simply looked at the man in charge and said 5 words, not loud, not trembling. Just 5 syllables that made the entire SWAT team freeze mid-breath. "Call General Edward McCade now." No one moved. No one dared. Because behind those 5 words was a history none of them could measure. And a man they had just mistaken for ordinary. Before the day ended, they'd be silent, ashamed, and left standing still as a ghost in oil-stained boots walked past them without a glance. Some medals live in drawers, some names never make it into textbooks, but true service leaves a shadow you can't ignore. If you've ever believed that dignity doesn't retire and respect can't be pawned, stay with this story. Type honor if you know silence sometimes speaks the loudest. And if you still believe there's a place in this world for quiet men who once held the line, this is your place too. Joseph Callahan was 69 years old, but carried himself like the ghosts of younger men who never made it home. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hands rough as gravel and a jaw that hadn't known softness since his 20s. His white hair was clipped military short, face weathered and lined like old maps, and his eyes steel gray. Always seemed to look past the present into something heavier, something buried. Every morning at 6:00 sharp, he walked out into the driveway with a coffee mug in one hand and a rusted wrench in the other, like some ritual. Only he understood. His boots were always clean, even if his jeans were stained with oil. He never raised his voice, never bragged. Just fixed engines for neighbors, built ramps for disabled vets, and taught shop class to kids other teachers had written off. He lived with his wife Marianne in a single-story home tucked behind a willow tree on Ridgeline Drive. Modest, quiet, 2 flags flying in the yard. One American, one Palmia. 27 years of service across continents, in places whose names were never printed in newspapers. That's what the patch inside his old duffel bag meant. A scar traced from his collarbone to his ribs. A gift from a mission that saved 21 soldiers. But out here, on this suburban street, people just called him the old mechanic. If they noticed him at all. The young cop who once passed him at the gas station didn't even nod. The boy at the checkout scanned his groceries without a word. And last week, someone left a senior citizen discount flyer on his truck windshield, as if he were just another old man fading into lawnmower afternoons. That morning, as the September air sharpened, Joe stood beneath the hood of Mrs. Henderson's Buick, changing oil when he heard it. The tires. Too fast, too tight. His hand stilled. His eyes narrowed. Something was coming. It began with tires, thick, armored, all-terrain, screeching across asphalt not built for speed. Joe looked up from beneath the Buick's rust-stained undercarriage, just in time to see the black SUV swing sideways, blocking his driveway like a barricade. 3 more followed in formation, flanking the street with brutal symmetry. Doors flew open. Boots hit pavement. Shouts cut through the calm like rifle cracks. "Police, down on the ground. Hands where we can see them." The neighbors didn't come out. Curtains shifted slightly, then went still. The only sound besides barking orders was the idle hum of idling engines and the metallic jingle of weapons locking into position. Joe raised his hands slowly, palms out, oil-stained, and stepped forward. "There's some mistake," he began, voice low but firm. A rifle barrel leveled at his chest shut him up mid-sentence. "Down, now." The concrete was still warm beneath his cheek. A knee pressed into his spine. Zip tie cinched his wrists. He didn't fight. He didn't flinch. He just watched as one officer barked into a headset. "Secure the perimeter." Breach protocol confirmed. The garage. The house. The windows. All covered by black vests and mirrored visors. That's when her car pulled in. Marianne. Grocery bags in both arms. She stepped out with a soft smile, unaware, until she saw the guns. "Joe!" Her voice cracked in the middle of his name. 3 rifles turned toward her like radar turrets tracking heat. "Drop the bags. Hands up." She froze. I don't understand." One of the younger officers, barely old enough to shave, shouted again, his voice shaking. "Final warning, ma'am." She started to lower the bags, but the arthritis in her hands wouldn't let go fast enough. "Non-compliant subject," someone said behind a visor. And then came the pop, the electric hiss. Her body seized, arms flinging wide as the bags exploded, eggs cracking like bones, apples scattering like shrapnel, milk arcing through the air like a white scream. She hit the ground with a thud that Joe felt in his chest more than his ears. And still, he said nothing. Didn't beg. Didn't rage. Just looked up from the pavement, calm as midnight, and locked eyes with the man in charge. The commander hesitated. Not out of fear, not yet, but because something in Joe's gaze didn't match the narrative they'd been briefed on. That quiet stillness wasn't confusion. It was memory. Precision. A silence that spoke fluent command. Around them, not a single neighbor stepped out. Not a phone raised. Not a word. The silence of witnesses pretending they hadn't seen. The silence that makes things like this possible. But Joe didn't need them. He shifted slightly, his breath shallow but deliberate, and said it, not loud, not shaking. "Let me up." A pause, long enough to feel like judgment. And then, the first crack in the facade. The commander gave a single nod. Just one. That's when it began to unravel. Under the fading afternoon sun, the neighborhood stood frozen like a diorama. Static, quiet, waiting to breathe. The SWAT team held their formation. Weapons still aimed, radios buzzing softly with unfinished protocol. Joe remained on his knees, wrists bound behind his back, sweat mixing with engine grease, as it slid down the side of his weathered face. His wife lay motionless beside him, her blouse scorched at the center where the taser barbs had struck, paper bags torn open like collapsed lungs, milk spreading in a slow, curdling pool beneath her shoulder. And then, from somewhere beyond the outer ring of armored vests and ballistic shields, came the sound of gravel under tires. Not screeching, not panic. Just slow. Controlled. Deliberate. A black government sedan pulled up to the curb without urgency. No lights. No sirens. No barked orders. Just presence. The kind of arrival that didn't ask permission. The rear door opened, and a single figure stepped out. Tall, measured, carrying a stillness more commanding than any weapon on the scene. He wore a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored to his frame, but moved like someone long conditioned by uniform. His silver hair was cut to precise military standard. Eyes the color of slate swept the scene once was all he needed. He didn't ask questions. He didn't show a badge. He just started walking. One of the younger officers muttered under his breath, "Who the hell is that?" Another, older, more experienced, went pale. "General Edward McCade," he said, barely above a whisper. "That's McCade." The name moved faster than orders, faster than rank. It sank into every spine on the driveway like ice water. Rifles wavered, not dropped, not lowered, but hesitant, as if even steel understood the change in atmosphere. The SWAT commander instinctively moved to intercept, his tactical vest creaking under tension, but the general never broke stride. He passed the commander like he didn't exist. His eyes never left the man on the ground. Joe Callahan looked up. No surprise, no relief, just recognition. The kind forged in darker places, sealed by things neither of them had ever put into words. McCade stopped exactly 4 feet from Joe. Not 5. Not 3. 4. Precision mattered to men like him. He looked down at Marianne, still unmoving, then back to Joe. And for a moment, nothing else existed. Not the stunned officers, not the buzzing radios, not the watching neighbors behind their curtains. Just two men, one standing, one bound, who had once fought the same invisible wars. And then, without breaking eye contact, General McCade raised his right hand in a salute sharp enough to slice the air in two. Every breath in the yard caught. No one salutes the man on the ground. No one, unless Joe returned it. Still, on his knees. Still, zip-tied. But when his hand rose, slow, measured, undeniable, time stopped. The rifles no longer mattered. The chain of command no longer mattered. Even gravity seemed to pause in that gesture. A silence fell, not the cowardly kind from before, but something ancient, reverent. Bring Dieu, the kind carved into marble and memory. And then, just as the salute lowered, McCade turned his head slightly and spoke only 3 words. Cut him loose. No one moved at first. Then someone did. And from that moment on, the air never felt the same again. The zip ties fell first, cut with one clean motion by the commander's own blade, the edges of authority dulling in real time. Joe didn't rise immediately. He rubbed his wrists, slow and steady, eyes never leaving the ground, like a man measuring how deep the line had just been drawn. General McCade remained beside him, silent, unreadable, as the last echoes of control drained from the driveway. Then McCade turned, not to help Joe stand, but to face the one responsible for the damage. Officer Tyler Knox Ductet. The young cop stood near the patrol SUV, helmet off now, hair matted with sweat, trying hard to square his jaw like the training manual told him. But the facade cracked the moment McCade started walking. Every boot step was measured, unhurried, like a countdown. When the general stopped 3 feet away, the entire perimeter tensed. No words yet. No gesture. Just silence. Oppressive. Suffocating. Complete. McCade spoke first. Was it protocol to taser a 70-year-old woman holding groceries? Knox tried to smirk, but it came out crooked. Sir, I followed the threat matrix. She didn't comply. McCade's voice didn't rise. Didn't drop the eggs fast enough? Someone near the garage shifted, then froze again. The stillness returned. Knox glanced sideways, hoping someone would step in, someone would back him up. No one did. His eyes landed on Joe, who now stood behind the general, arms loose at his sides, oil still staining his sleeves. Joe didn't speak. He didn't need to. McCade reached slowly into his inner jacket. No weapon, just a small, black case. He opened it with the care of a man revealing something sacred. Inside, a badge, one not seen often. Its insignia bore no letters, no rank, only a mark known by less than 20 men in uniform. He held it up, not to boast, but to let the truth breathe. You just assaulted a tier 1 strategic asset cleared under the Black Protocol Initiative, McCade said calmly, letting each word drop like stone in water. You've made contact with a man who wrote the original breaching doctrine your entire unit trains on. The air collapsed. You could hear the wind change. Knox smirk-eyed. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. A bead of sweat ran from temple to jawline, trailing guilt. He looked around again, only now realizing every eye was on him, but no hand would save him. They weren't silent out of confusion. They were silent because history had entered the room and picked a side. McCade stepped once, just enough to lean in. Closer. Quieter. Which manual told you to aim at someone's wife? Knox blinked. Once. Then again. The arrogance was gone now, peeled off his face like a mask too tight to wear. The general didn't touch him, didn't raise his voice. And still, Tyler Knox took half a step back. That was the first time he looked afraid. Under the weight of that afternoon sun, now lower, casting long shadows across the oil-stained driveway and the silent faces pressed against windows. There came the unmistakable sound of finality. The slow roll of a single sheriff's cruiser, no lights, no sirens, just the kind of arrival that didn't ask for attention, because it already came with consequences. The vehicle halted behind the last tactical van, and out stepped Sheriff Walter Griggs, a man not easily rattled, not easily read. 34 years in uniform, tie never crooked, voice never loud, eyes that had seen too many men lose themselves behind a badge. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. Because someone, maybe the neighbor, maybe someone inside the team, had sent him what mattered most. Truth, captured without excuses. He moved straight toward the center of the scene, not to the general, not to the kneeling man, but to the boy who had mistaken noise for authority. Officer Knox straightened his posture by instinct, but the effort felt borrowed, flimsy. The sheriff didn't speak. He lifted an old phone, tapped once, and the video began. No music. No edits. Just raw clarity. Marian Datuar. Marian. Hands up. Voice calm. A split second. Then, the jolt. Her frame seizing mid-turn, groceries torn from her arms, eggs rupturing like bones, milk flaring against the pavement like a soft explosion. The frame froze on her face, more confusion than fear, more rage than threat. A silence dropped across the lawn like a shroud. Knox's mouth opened, but his breath stuttered halfway out. His hand moved slightly, pointless without meaning. He didn't speak. He couldn't, because the video had done what no voice could, ended the conversation. Sheriff Griggs turned once, slowly, to the SWAT unit. Secure him. No orders needed. 2 officers stepped forward. Knox didn't run, didn't resist, just sagged slightly as the cuffs slid into place. The same plastic flex ties he had used without hesitation. As they walked him past the house, past Joe, past Marianne, now seated with a blanket drawn around her like armor, Knox never lifted his eyes. Not out of defiance, but because shame has weight, and that weight bent his neck like gravity itself had passed judgment. Joe never moved, never said a word, but he watched. And in that gaze, a level, weathered, impossible to escape, there was a lifetime of truths that didn't need volume. Across the yard, one neighbor slowly removed his cap. Another whispered, "We should have said something." No one replied. And when the patrol car door shut behind Tyler Knox, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. The street emptied slowly, not like an evacuation, but like a weight being lifted one person at a time. Doors opened. Porch lights flicked on though the sun hadn't yet set, and neighbors who had pretended to be busy now lingered at the edges of their own fences, unsure of how to step forward without stepping too close. No one clapped. No one cheered. The silence hadn't lifted. It had shifted, softened, turned into something more fragile, like regret trying to take its first breath. The boy from 2 houses down, barely old enough to understand the shame hanging in the air, crossed the yard holding a folded American flag, clumsily carried, his arms too small for its weight. He didn't say anything, just looked up at Joe and held it out, not as a gift, not as apology, but simply as something he didn't know what to do with anymore. Joe took it gently, nodded once, no words, and that was enough. From across the street, Mrs. Dobbins, the same woman who had once called code enforcement when Joe fixed his truck in the driveway, walked over with a mug of black coffee wrapped in both her hands. She didn't look him in the eye. She just extended it with trembling fingers, then whispered, "It's how you used to take it. I remember now." Joe accepted it, not because he needed it, but because she needed to give it. She walked away before he could respond. Behind her, a man who hadn't said a word in 20 years, unless it was about lawn height, stepped forward and offered his hand. Joe didn't shake it. He gripped it, firm. Pam. Short. Died. Final. Do. And the man, red around the eyes, nodded like he'd been waiting his whole life to be forgiven. Even the SWAT officers, now standing in a loose circle near their vehicles, looked smaller than they had hours before. One removed his vest. Another laid his rifle down on the hood of the SUV and walked away, head low. No one spoke of justice. No one tried to explain. And Joe, he stood there, steady, holding that flag, not like a prize, but like a memory, and looked out at a town that was finally beginning to see itself clearly. Not through noise, not through orders, but through what it had failed to do, and what it might still become. He didn't tell them they were wrong. He didn't ask them to do better. He just looked down at the coffee, then back at the house where Mary Ann sat by the window, and said softly, like it was more to himself than anyone else, "This place used to feel like home. Maybe it can be again." The garage that once bore the sting of silence now carried a different kind of quiet, one lined with memory, not regret. Where oil had stained the concrete, a modest wooden bench had been placed, hand-carved by a retired carpenter who said nothing but dropped it off one morning before dawn. Above it, a new American flag hung, clean, crisp, never left out overnight, hoisted not by order, but by hands that once looked away and now rose early just to raise it right. Inside Murphy's bar, something had changed, not in the music, not in the beer prices, but in the walls themselves. A frame now rested behind glass near the jukebox. An old photo of Joe in uniform, standing beside Mary Ann, her smile brighter than the medals pinned to his chest. Beneath the photo, a simple plaque read, "He never asked for thanks, so we learned to give it." No one said who put it there. No one needed to. Students from the high school began arriving in pairs, then trios, then whole classes, sometimes for history projects, sometimes with no reason at all, asking to speak with Mr. Whitaker. He never gave speeches. He just listened, sometimes nodded, and handed them old unit patches from a box he kept under the stairs. One boy came back weeks later, wearing that patch sewn inside his jacket collar. Another left behind a folded note. "You made me want to stand straighter." It was never a parade. It was a mural, painted by veterans and volunteers, behind the diner, depicting the outline of Joe's silhouette, saluting under a broken sky, stitched with golden thread. No face, no name, just the gesture, immortalized in shadow and gold. At night, they left one small light on it, just enough. Joe never asked why. He never stood beneath it or posed for a photo. But once, just once, he walked by with his toolbox in hand, paused for the briefest moment, looked up, and adjusted the strap on his shoulder. That was enough for the kids painting it. They never asked for more. At the local library, a display case appeared, donated anonymously, housing a pair of worn combat boots, one folded letter addressed to EEN, a service coin dulled with time. Visitors leaned in close, as if whispering would somehow protect the reverence sealed behind the glass. Joe's voice didn't echo through podcasts or interviews. It lived in the spaces between other men's words, veterans who now told his story in barber shops, classrooms, and front porches, each adding a detail, a pause, a silence of their own. His quiet had become their voice. And in that quiet, things grew. The town didn't become perfect. People didn't always remember, but they remembered enough. And every morning, when Joe stepped onto that driveway, a few cars slowed. A few heads nodded. Not out of obligation, but because some truths, once seen, won't go unseen again. And on the window of Murphy's, just below that photo, someone had etched in the corner, "Steady hands still hold us together." Joe never touched it. But one morning, he looked at it and smiled. In the far corner of Murphy's bar, where the booth sat under the flicker of a dusty neon sign, and the hum of an old ceiling fan kept time with the afternoon stillness, Two men shared the kind of silence only years and war could build. The general had changed out of uniform, but the weight never left his shoulders, just sat differently now, quieter. Joe wore his usual faded flannel, hands rough from bolts and memories, a coffee cup between them that hadn't been touched in minutes. No one else sat nearby. No one needed to. The jukebox had been fixed recently. It played soft, one of those old country tunes where the guitar feels older than the voice. Outside, sunlight slanted through half-closed blinds, drawing clean lines across the table, across the two mugs, across the space that once held anger, now filled only with something unspoken. The general took a sip, set the cup down, then leaned back, arms stretched along the top of the booth, like he used to do when he was 10, and trying to act bigger than he was. "You okay, old man?" he said, not teasing, not soft, just enough to land somewhere between habit and apology. Joe didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He just looked over. Slow, thoughtful, then nodded once. Not a yes, not a no, just acknowledgement, just presence. A moment passed. Then the general reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out, not ceremonious, not rehearsed. Just an old dog tag, dulled by time and dusted with fingerprints. The chain still looped the way it had been the day he'd taken it off a battlefield long ago. He slid it across the table, the metal whispering against the wood. "Found it in my drawer. Figured you kept mine long enough." Joe looked at it, didn't touch it at first, just stared, like it held something heavier than metal. Then, slow and sure, he picked it up, turned it once in his palm, and tucked it into his front pocket without a word. The general didn't smile, but something in his face eased, just slightly, like a fist unclenching after a decade. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees. The door chimed as someone left, but neither man turned. The waitress brought over 2 fresh cups, unasked for, unnecessary, but understood. She placed them gently, then walked away. The steam curled up, catching in the afternoon light. They didn't toast. They didn't talk. But after a while, Joe reached across the table and tapped his son's mug with the edge of his own, light, brief, like a knock on a door that had already been opened. They sat a little longer, letting the warmth settle into their hands. Then, as the song faded and the room turned amber in the light of late day, both men stood, almost at the same time. No cue, no signal, just timing. Joe adjusted his cap. The general adjusted nothing. They walked out together, not side by side, but close enough. In the weeks that followed, the name Frank Whitaker began to take on a rhythm all its own, not loud, not broadcast, but passed from voice to voice, like something worn into the grain of town benches and the seams of church pews. It started in whispers, in places where stories are weighed heavier than headlines. Barbershops with radios low in the background, school corridors between classes, and libraries where fingers paused on book spines just to say, "Did you hear about the man at Murphy's?" A history teacher at the local high school began her lesson differently one day, not with dates or maps, but with the sound of silence. Then she played the video. Not the confrontation, not the arrest. Just the moment Frank stood there, still, quiet, dignified, while others shouted. The students didn't fidget. One girl, who usually sat near the back with her arms crossed, asked if they could write letters to other veterans. Not for grades, just because. At a playground near the town's edge, someone had bolted a new flagpole. No plaque, no donation name, just a simple note taped to the base. For the ones we forgot to stand for. Every morning since, one boy, no more than 10, made sure the flag never touched the ground. At the church on Main, the pastor didn't mention Frank by name. He didn't have to. But when he spoke of strength without volume, of grace without performance, everyone knew. A man near the back, raw hands, paint on his jeans, nodded slow. And at the end of service he waited until the room had cleared before walking up to Joe and placing a folded note in his hand. Just 3 words inside. He changed me. Frank never spoke of it. Never asked who was talking. He still fixed things when asked, still nodded at neighbors from behind the wheel of his rusted truck, still sat on the same bench outside the hardware store on Fridays. But people started sitting next to him, not for advice, just to be near that stillness. One morning, a teenage boy pulled over his bike at the gas station and asked, nervously, if Frank had really been in the 82nd Airborne. Frank only shrugged. But when the boy offered a handshake, Frank took it. Firm, steady, and for the rest of the ride home the boy didn't let go of the handlebars with that hand. Not once. Even the local paper, usually filled with lost pets and bake sales, ran a piece titled, "A Town Remembered Itself." It didn't quote Frank. It quoted others. A waitress, a neighbor, his son, and each line had less to do with what he did, and more to do with how he made others want to be. At the library, a child pointed to the photo of Frank and asked his mother if heroes always wore capes. She smiled, knelt beside him, and whispered, "No, sometimes they just stand still when the world needs them to." And outside Murphy's bar, where the mural still watched over the alley in golden shadow, the flag caught the wind again, just right. Snapping once, clean and proud, and someone passing by stopped and saluted. The bar never went back to how it was. Not really. The jukebox still played, the stools still creaked, and the bell above the door still gave its tired chime every time someone came in from the cold. But ever since that day, something lingered in the corners, like a folded flag, never quite put away. On the far wall, beneath the soft hum of an overhead fan, hung a photo of Frank Whitaker, standing alone, hands in his pockets, the breeze catching the edge of the flag behind him. No pose, no medals, just a man. Upright, like truth made flesh. That morning, he stepped out quietly. Same boots, same slow gait, but when he reached the curb, he paused. Looked out at the town now watching him, not because he demanded it, but because they finally chose to. One hand touched the brim of his cap. One child placed a hand to his heart. And as the wind lifted the flag behind him, just once, sharp and clean, the music inside the bar faded, the voices stilled, and everyone stood. Not for a performance, but for the man who never asked. Frank looked out and said softly, not to the crowd, not even to himself, but to the silence that had finally become respect. All I ever wanted was to walk home standing up. If you felt something in that silence, type dignity in the comments below. And if you believe some men don't need a podium to be remembered, just a little stillness, and the eyes of those who finally see, then this is a channel you belong to.